73 men tried. 73 men failed. The best lasted 6 seconds. Marcus Webb had defended the Southern Regional Karate Championship for 4 consecutive years, 47 consecutive victories. Not one challenger had lasted 9 seconds. The tournament was held every June in Memphis, Tennessee, and for 48 consecutive months, Webb's name was carved deeper into the trophy case. 5,000 people packed the Ellis Auditorium on June 15, 1969. The smell of sweat and floor wax filled the air. The crowd roared as each preliminary round ended, the usual noise, the usual dismissals, but everyone was there for Webb. Not for the tournament, for him. Webb stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, weighed 215 pounds, every inch of it dense with muscle built across 2 decades of training under Sensei Harold Tatum in Nashville. His hands were calloused from 10,000 striking drills. His kicks could splinter pine boards stacked 4 deep. He had knocked fighters unconscious without warning, without emotion. His body simply knew how to hurt people. The scar tissue around his knuckles told the story nobody needed to hear twice. Stay away from Marcus Webb. He was a regional legend in the way that only regional legends can be. Everyone knew his name. Everyone told his stories. Nobody wanted to face him. The tournament organizers had quietly stopped allowing fighters under 180 pounds to enter the championship round. The liability had become too much. Webb didn't just win. Webb made people understand the limits of their own bodies. His style was relentless pressure. He moved forward every single second. No retreat, no hesitation. He would close distance with a controlled walk, hands high, and then, without any tell, without any setup, a roundhouse kick would come from his hip with enough force to end fights. Fighters who had won state tournaments froze when they saw him move. They already knew it was over. The scoreboard showed Webb's record: 47 wins, 0 losses. 47 regional challengers, all defeated. The last challenger had lasted 4 seconds. A fighter named Raymond Cho had come from Atlanta with a 23-win streak of his own. Webb broke 3 of Cho's ribs. Cho had to be helped out of the ring. The crowd didn't cheer. The crowd went silent. That was Webb's signature. Not the victory, the silence afterward. But something was wrong in the back. Chuck Norris arrived at the Ellis Auditorium at 2:47 p.m. with his right hand wrapped in black athletic tape under a loose cotton glove. He had driven down from Dallas that morning. The drive was 6 hours. He'd woken up at 4 a.m. He didn't mention the hand to anyone because there was nothing to mention yet, just pain in a decision he'd already made before he even left the driveway. Steve Reeves, who had trained with Chuck for 18 months at his Dallas karate studio, noticed it immediately. "Your hand," Steve said. They were in the lobby, moving toward the registration table. Chuck was wearing a gray karate gi, barefoot, his expression exactly the same as it always was: settled, present, ready. "I'm fighting today," Chuck said. "I can see that, but your hand is fine," Chuck said. Steve was 26 years old. He had trained in karate for 4 years. He had won 2 regional tournaments of his own. He knew the difference between pain and injury, and he knew Chuck well enough to understand that asking the same question twice was going to get him nowhere. "Webb is brutal," Steve said instead. "His warm-ups look like he's trying to kill someone. I watched him in 1967. He put a guy in the hospital, separated shoulder." Chuck looked at Steve, just looked at him. The kind of look that wasn't unkind, but that suggested Steve should consider not saying the next thing he was planning to say. "He's a good champion. That's why we step up." The registration was simple. Fill out a card, confirm your weight and record. Chuck was 5'10", 180 pounds. His record was listed as 32 wins, 3 losses. The 3 losses were honest. 2 were to Bruce Lee during training exhibitions. 1 was to Joe Louis in California in 1967. Louis had caught him with a spinning back kick when Chuck had gotten careless. Chuck had learned something from each one. Webb's record was entered as 47 wins, 0 losses. The tournament structure was straightforward. 6 preliminary rounds of 3 minutes each. Winners advanced, losers went home. The championship round was 5 minutes. the same as Webb's previous 47 victories. Chuck's preliminary fights were scheduled for 3:15 p.m., 3:35 p.m., and 3:55 p.m. Webb's preliminary fights were scheduled for 4:15 p.m., 4:45 p.m., and 4:55 p.m. The championship would start at 5:30 p.m., 3 hours and 43 minutes from the moment Chuck walked into the building. The pain in Chuck's right hand was a specific kind of sharp, not a throb, but a bright white line of fire that ran from his knuckle to his wrist. He had fallen 2 days ago during a training session with his staff, a simple takedown gone wrong. He'd put out his hand to catch himself, and his hand had decided to break instead. The X-rays had confirmed it that morning, a hairline fracture across the third metacarpal bone. The doctor had said, no fighting for 6 weeks, minimum. Chuck had asked, is it going to get worse if I don't see the X-rays? The doctor understood the question for what it was. Yes, potentially, yes, depending on what you do with it. Chuck thanked him and left the office. Steve didn't know the details. Steve just knew something was wrong and that Chuck wasn't going to tell him what it was. Steve had made peace with that 15 minutes ago. That was how it worked with Chuck. You either trusted his judgment or you didn't. Somewhere in there, trust meant accepting that you didn't get all the information. The crowd noise was building by 3 p.m. 5,000 people meant exactly what it meant. 5,000 people who wanted to see Webb destroy someone. The preliminary rounds were entertaining, but they were just set up. Everyone was waiting for 5:30 p.m. Everyone was waiting to watch Webb make his 48th consecutive victim understand the specific shape of their own limitations. Chuck fought 3 men in 90 minutes. The first man was a fighter named Davis from Houston. Decent fundamentals, clean technique. Chuck controlled the distance, executed 2 perfect side kicks, and won 6-0. The fight lasted 2 minutes 14 seconds. The crowd didn't react much. This wasn't Webb. The second was a fighter named Patterson, a heavyweight with more strength than technique. Chuck redirected Patterson's momentum twice and caught him with a reverse punch that scored 4 points. Patterson tried one more time. Chuck caught the kick and swept him to the mat, 8-1. The crowd politely applauded, still waiting for Webb. The third was a fighter named Holloway with a 19-win streak and genuine skill. This one lasted closer to 3 minutes. Holloway was faster than Davis. Holloway understood distance, but Holloway never fought someone who saw the fight 3 seconds before it happened. Chuck was already moving to where Holloway's kick was going before Holloway had decided to throw it. Chuck won 9-3. The crowd applauded. Chuck was undefeated in his preliminary rounds, but his name wasn't on anyone's mind. Only Steve was watching Chuck's right hand. Only Steve saw the way Chuck's left side had done all the work. The left hand strikes, the left side kicks, the left side blocks and deflections. Every single movement had been constructed on the assumption that the right hand didn't exist. A fighter who knew what to look for would notice something was being hidden. Steve knew what to look for. He didn't say anything. Steve had learned that lesson. Webb fought his 3 preliminary rounds in even more brutal fashion. The first challenger lasted 3 seconds, a straight roundhouse kick that landed on the neck. The man fell. Webb didn't celebrate. Webb never celebrated. The second lasted 7 seconds, a clinch followed by an elbow strike. The man's nose broke. Blood made a perfect arc across the mat. The crowd winced. Webb had already turned away before the man hit the ground. The crowd was absolutely silent between rounds. That was the thing about Webb. Watching him wasn't fun. Watching him was like watching someone who had figured out violence in a way that most people never did. It wasn't about anger. It was about precision. He was a surgeon who happened to use a gi instead of a white coat.
300 fighters had tried to schedule matches with Webb in the previous 18 months. 73 had actually shown up. 47 victories. 26 of those fighters never competed again. The championship round was scheduled to begin at 5:30 p.m. At 5:25 p.m., Chuck and Webb entered the arena from opposite sides. The crowd stood immediately, all 5,000 people. The roar was the kind of roar that filled a room with pure kinetic energy, not excitement so much as the release of pressure that had been building all day. Webb was wearing a white gi, pristine, no wrinkles. His black belt was tied perfectly. His face was completely neutral. He was looking at something that existed beyond the physical boundaries of the arena. He was already doing the fight in his mind. He was already winning. Chuck was wearing a white gi with a gray belt. His right hand was wrapped in athletic tape under the glove. The tape was visible, but to most of the crowd, it looked like minor protection, the kind of thing a lot of fighters wore. To Steve, sitting in the third row, it looked like a confession. The referee called them to the center of the mat. "Fighters ready?" the referee said. Chuck nodded. Webb nodded. "Begin." Webb moved forward immediately. This was his pattern. Close distance, apply pressure, make the opponent react instead of act. He walked forward with his hands high and his shoulders relaxed. Absolutely no tension in his face. He had done this 47 times. He already knew how this ended. Chuck moved backwards slightly, creating distance. Webb closed it. Chuck moved backward again. This was Webb's game. He was patient. He understood that time was his weapon. He would walk through the entire 5 minutes if that's what it took. He would keep walking forward until the opponent made a mistake, and then he would capitalize with something that ended the fight. The crowd watched in perfect silence. 45 seconds into the fight, Webb threw a roundhouse kick. It was the kick that had put 47 men on the ground. It came from his hip with perfect rotation. It had the weight of his entire body behind it. It was the kind of kick that changed the shape of bone. Chuck saw it coming. He didn't block it directly. Blocking it would have required his right hand, and his right hand was only useful as a thing to hide. Instead, Chuck slipped the kick, moving his upper body offline by 8 inches. The kick passed an inch in front of his face. The wind from the kick made Chuck's hair move. Webb had expected contact. Instead, there was only air. The crowd gasped. Webb recovered immediately and reset. No emotion. He adjusted his distance and threw a left-hand punch. It was controlled, not full power, not yet, just testing. Chuck deflected it with his left forearm and moved backward again. 2 minutes and 15 seconds into the fight, Webb threw a back fist strike. Chuck slipped it. A front kick followed. Chuck redirected it with his left knee, absorbing the impact and rolling backward with it. A spinning heel kick. Chuck dropped to the mat and let it pass over him. The crowd was starting to understand that something was happening that they hadn't expected. Something was changing. Think about what Chuck already knew that nobody else in that arena had figured out yet. Webb's entire offensive arsenal was built on overwhelming power. His kicks were designed to hurt. His strikes were designed to cause damage. His pressure was designed to create panic. He had trained for 20 years under the assumption that raw force, applied with precision and timing, would always overcome technique. But he had never fought someone who understood that sometimes the best defense was to not be there when the force arrived. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Webb was breathing harder than he had in any of his 47 previous fights. He was not injured, he was not tired, but something about this was different. Chuck was still moving backward. Chuck was still not engaging, but the pattern was starting to feel wrong to Webb. The rhythm was off. His kicks weren't landing, his strikes weren't connecting, and his opponent wasn't looking scared. That was new. Every opponent looked scared at some point. Steve was watching Chuck's right hand. It was never used. It was never pulled out of the glove. It was kept tight against Chuck's body in the classic defensive posture, but it had become something else. It had become invisible. It had become a secret. And in the moment that a fighter started to wonder about the invisible hand, that fighter had already lost. Webb threw another roundhouse kick. Chuck slipped it. Webb recovered and immediately threw a front kick. Chuck redirected it. Webb's eyes narrowed for the first time. He changed tactics. At 4 minutes and 10 seconds, Webb stopped moving forward. Instead, he planted his feet and began throwing combinations: left punch, right kick, spinning back fist. He was trying to create an overwhelming volume of attacks. He was trying to force Chuck to block something. He was trying to force contact. Chuck continued slipping and redirecting, but now something was different. Now Chuck was beginning to move forward. Not much, just an inch every few seconds, but forward. The distance was closing, but not because Webb was pursuing. It was closing because Chuck was choosing to close it. The crowd could feel the shift. The energy in the arena changed. 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Webb threw a roundhouse kick from his right leg. Chuck didn't slip it this time. Instead, Chuck stepped into the kick. His left foot moved forward, angling his body at 45 degrees. Webb's kick landed against the side of Chuck's left ribs instead of full force in his center. The impact was absorbed by Chuck's body mass and his angle. Webb had expected to end the fight with this kick. He had ended many fights with exactly this kick. Instead, Chuck was still standing, and now Chuck was inside Webb's distance. Webb immediately threw a clinch. He wrapped his arms around Chuck's body. The referee did not call it. This was still legal in 1969. Webb tried to drag Chuck down to the mat. Webb's wrestling base was strong. His strength was crushing. But Chuck had understood something about Marcus Webb that nobody else in that arena had figured out. Webb had built an entire fighting system on moving forward and creating distance. Webb had never trained against someone who didn't care about being clinched. Webb had never trained against someone who understood that being trapped could be another kind of freedom. Chuck dropped his hips. Webb pulled harder. Chuck turned his hips. Webb couldn't contain him. 52 seconds remained on the clock. Chuck broke the clinch and created distance again. He was breathing normally. Webb was breathing harder. Webb had used more energy in the last 30 seconds than he had in his 47 previous fights combined. Webb's mind was working through the problem. Webb was thinking, I am a better fighter. I am stronger. I have more experience. I have 47 wins. I am invincible. Webb was also thinking, nothing I have tried has worked. Webb was also thinking, I don't know why.
The final exchange lasted 4 seconds. Webb threw a roundhouse kick, the same kick that had started the fight, the kick that had worked 47 times before. But now he was committed. He wasn't testing. He was finally going for damage. Chuck saw the kick coming. This time, instead of slipping, Chuck stepped forward into his left. His left hand came up in a perfect ridge hand strike, the bone of his forearm flat and weaponized, traveling horizontally across his body. The ridge hand connected with the inside of Webb's thigh at the exact moment Webb's weight shifted. It was a technique called checking the leg. It disrupted the power, disrupted the balance, and disrupted the intent. Webb's kick lost all its force. Chuck's left leg came up in a high roundhouse kick, rotating his body completely horizontal to the ground, his foot coming across at Webb's head height. The kick was controlled. It passed 1 inch from Webb's right temple. It would have connected if Webb hadn't been falling backward. Webb sat down hard on the mat. The referee moved in. Webb was conscious. Webb was not injured. But Webb was sitting on the mat with no idea how he had gotten there. The crowd erupted, not with cheers at first, but with shock, the kind of noise that happens when a thing everyone assumed was impossible has just occurred. 5,000 people were making sound because they had just watched Marcus Webb, the regional champion, lose his balance against someone they didn't know. Chuck stepped back. He did not celebrate. He did not raise his fists. He did not express any emotion whatsoever. The stillness was the statement. Webb took 10 seconds to stand up. The referee did not rush the count. Webb rose slowly, and when he was back on his feet, the referee asked him, "Can you continue?" Webb nodded. The referee reset them. 38 seconds remained. Webb moved forward again, but his pattern was broken. His timing was hesitant. His rhythm was gone. Chuck moved backward again, but now the crowd understood what was happening. Chuck was in control. Webb was reacting. The fundamental truth of the fight had inverted. Webb threw a punch. Chuck deflected it with his left hand. Webb threw a kick. Chuck slipped it. Webb threw another punch. Chuck continued to move backward. The final 12 seconds of the fight were just Chuck avoiding what Webb could no longer deliver. When the buzzer sounded, Chuck was still standing in perfect form. Webb was standing with his hands down and his breath coming in short pulls.
The referee raised Chuck's hand. The crowd noise was deafening. Afterward, in the back room where Chuck was unwrapping his hand, Steve was waiting. Steve watched as the tape came off. The right hand was swollen. The bruising had already started to deepen. The bone was fractured directly across the knuckle, and the pain was the kind that made your entire arm feel like it was on fire. "How bad?" Steve asked. "Bad," Chuck said. "You fought the entire championship round with a broken hand?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell anyone? The referee could have—" "Could have what?" Chuck said. "Given Webb an excuse? This wasn't about me. It was about what Webb needed to understand." "What did he need to understand?" Chuck was wrapping his hand in fresh tape, the kind of tape that would keep the swelling down for the drive back to Dallas. That strength without understanding is just power. Power without adaptability is just a problem waiting for a solution. Marcus Webb never fought competitively again. He returned to Nashville and continued teaching at his dojo. He trained students the way he always had, with discipline and precision. But something had shifted. He began to study footwork. He began to understand that the style that worked 47 times only worked 47 times because he hadn't encountered someone who didn't care about the premise of his style. The story traveled. In dojos across the South, the story moved through the community in the way that stories do, told in training sessions, told between sets of push-ups, told by instructors to students who needed to understand that invincibility was always conditional. There was a fighter named Webb, undefeated, 47 wins, and then one day a man from Dallas showed up. 47 wins wasn't enough. By the time the story reached California, it had become simpler. Chuck Norris fought the best fighter in the South with a broken hand and never told anyone. By the time it reached the East Coast, it had become almost mythical. Chuck Norris fought the best fighter in the South with an injury that would have put anyone in the hospital. The details shifted, but the core remained. Sometimes the victory isn't about being the strongest. Sometimes the victory is about understanding that the other person's strength is a fact, but it's not a law. Chuck's right hand healed slowly. It took 8 weeks, not 6. He compensated by training his left side harder than he had ever trained anything. He incorporated more footwork drills. He studied how Bruce Lee had built a fighting system on speed and timing rather than power. Steve asked him once, about a year later, "If you had to fight Webb again, knowing what you knew, would you do anything differently?" Chuck thought about it. "I wouldn't fight him with a broken hand," he said finally. "That was stupid. But I would fight him the same way. Because the point wasn't about winning. The point was about showing him that his map of the world was incomplete." What happens when a champion realizes that invincibility is a story he has been telling himself? What happens when he understands that 47 victories don't protect you from the 48th encounter? What happens when the methodology that worked every other time doesn't work this time? Sometimes a fighter spends the rest of his life trying to understand that moment. Sometimes he builds a better system. Sometimes he understands that the victory wasn't the other man's. The victory was the lesson. And sometimes, in dojos across the country, the story gets told again. A man from Dallas, a broken hand, a champion who walked into the ring believing that strength was destiny, and the man who showed him it wasn't.